There is a reason you're hearing this right now, and it is not random. Something has already shifted, but not in the way you think, not in the external world you once questioned, but somewhere much deeper, somewhere inside you. Your first awakening may have felt like the moment everything finally made sense, like a veil had been lifted, and you could suddenly see through the patterns, the expectations, the roles you had been unconsciously playing. It showed you the life you were living was not entirely yours, that much of who you believed yourself to be had been shaped by forces you never consciously chose. That realization alone was powerful enough to change everything. But what is happening to you now is not the same kind of awakening. It is quieter, more disorienting, and far more unsettling. Because this time, it is not the world that is being revealed. It is you. The first awakening opens your eyes to the structures around you, to the invisible scripts of society, relationships, and identity that once guided your decisions without your awareness. You begin to notice how much of your behavior was driven by the need to be accepted, to belong, to avoid rejection. You start to understand boundaries, emotional patterns, and the deeper mechanics of connection. You read, you reflect, you observe. You feel like you're finally stepping into something real, and in many ways, you are. But what often goes unnoticed is that this phase, as profound as it feels, is only the beginning. It is a preparation, a clearing of the ground. It creates space, but it does not yet reveal the full depth of what lies beneath. What Jung discovered after years of observing this process in himself and others was that the first awakening is largely outward in its orientation. It teaches you to see through others, through systems, through inherited beliefs. It sharpens your awareness of how the external world shaped your inner life. And this feels liberating because, for the first time, you are not blindly following what was given to you. You are choosing. You are questioning. You are stepping out of unconscious patterns. But even in this freedom, something subtle is happening that most people do not notice. As you release one identity, you begin to form another. This new identity feels more authentic, more aligned, more conscious. You may see yourself as someone who has healed, someone who understands, someone who has awakened. You are no longer the person you used to be, and that difference feels meaningful. It feels like progress, and it is. But Jung warned that any identity built in contrast to a previous one is still reactive. It is still defined by what it rejects rather than by what it truly is. The healed self is defined by no longer being wounded. The aware self is defined by no longer being asleep. These are improvements, but they are not yet the whole. And this is where the second awakening begins. It does not arrive as clarity. It arrives as confusion. It does not feel like progress. It feels like something is unraveling. The practices that once grounded you may start to feel empty. The insights that once brought comfort may no longer hold the same meaning. The identity you carefully built after your first awakening begins to lose its solidity, not because it was false, but because it was incomplete. This is the moment where awareness turns inward, and instead of seeing through the world, you begin to see through yourself. This can feel like a betrayal. You did the work, you learned, you grew, you changed your behavior, you set boundaries, you built something that felt real, and now even that is being questioned. Even that is dissolving. Jung described this as the breakdown of the spiritual persona, the version of yourself that emerged from your first awakening and felt like your true identity. But the deeper truth is that it was still a construction, a more refined one, a more conscious one, but still something shaped by the mind. The second awakening begins when something deeper than the ego starts to move. Jung called this the self, not as an identity, but as the totality of who you are, including everything the ego cannot fully contain. The self is not interested in maintaining the image you have of yourself, even if that image is positive or evolved. It is interested in wholeness. And wholeness includes contradiction, complexity, and even the parts of you that your conscious identity would prefer to leave behind. This is why the second awakening feels so destabilizing, because it is not about improving the version of yourself you already know. It is about expanding beyond it. The ego, which guided the first awakening, begins to lose its central role, and from its perspective, this feels like losing control. It searches for new answers, new systems, new frameworks that can restore a sense of certainty. But what it encounters instead is uncertainty, a space where the old ways of understanding no longer apply. One of the first signs that this process has begun is that the tools you once relied on stop working in the same way. Meditation may no longer bring peace. Reflection may feel repetitive or hollow. The communities or ideas that once supported you may start to feel limiting. This is not because they were wrong. It is because they served a purpose, and that purpose has been fulfilled. What once acted as a guide is no longer needed in the same way, and letting go of that can feel like losing something important. Another sign is the return of old emotional patterns, but in a way that feels deeper and more intense. You may find yourself revisiting experiences you believed you had already processed. Feelings you thought you had resolved may surface again, stronger and less predictable. This often creates the illusion of regression, as if you're moving backward instead of forward. But what is actually happening is that you are encountering layers that were previously inaccessible to you. The first awakening allowed you to understand your patterns. The second invites you to experience them at a deeper level, beyond thought, beyond analysis. This process is not linear. It does not follow the logic of improvement or progression in the way the ego expects. It unfolds in cycles, often bringing you back to familiar territory, but with a different depth of awareness. What once felt like a problem to solve now becomes something to observe, something to feel, something to integrate. The focus shifts from fixing yourself to understanding yourself in a more complete way. Alongside this, there is often a profound sense of isolation. Not necessarily because you're physically alone, but because the experience itself is difficult to articulate. The first awakening is widely discussed. There are books, communities, and language that describe it. The second awakening, however, is less visible. It does not fit neatly into common narratives of growth or healing. It challenges the very frameworks that those narratives are built on. And because of this, it can feel like you are moving through something that others cannot fully understand. This isolation is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a natural part of the process. The second awakening requires a different kind of relationship with yourself, one that is less dependent on external validation or shared understanding. It asks you to trust something internal, something that does not always make sense, something that cannot always be explained. Your relationship with truth also begins to change. During the first awakening, truth often feels like clarity, like seeing things as they are, identifying what is healthy and what is not, recognizing patterns and naming them. But in the second awakening, truth becomes more complex. It is no longer about clear distinctions or simple answers. It involves recognizing contradictions, holding opposing perspectives, and accepting that multiple things can be true at the same time. You begin to see that the parts of yourself you once tried to eliminate may hold something valuable, that the qualities you resisted may have been protecting something essential, that even the aspects of your experience that felt negative or uncomfortable are part of a larger whole. This is the beginning of integrating what Jung called the shadow, not as something to overcome, but as something to understand and include. And as this integration deepens, your sense of identity becomes less fixed. You may find it harder to define yourself in the ways you once did. Labels that once felt accurate may no longer fit. This can feel unsettling at first because the ego seeks stability through definition. But what emerges in place of that is something more fluid, more adaptable, more aligned with the complexity of your actual experience. You're no longer trying to become a specific version of yourself. You are learning to respond to life as it unfolds without needing to fit everything into a predefined structure. This is not confusion. It is a different kind of clarity, one that does not rely on certainty, but on presence. And this is only the beginning of what the second awakening reveals. What Jung found most challenging to articulate about this second phase is not just what it dismantles, but what it replaces it with. Because the mind naturally expects that when one identity dissolves, another will take its place. That is how the first awakening worked. You let go of one version of yourself and stepped into a new one that felt more aligned. But the second awakening does not follow that pattern. It does not offer you a new identity to hold on to. Instead, it slowly removes the need to define yourself at all. This is where the experience can feel like losing direction. The ego wants clarity, a stable sense of who you are, where you're going, and what everything means. But the self does not operate through fixed definitions. It moves through experience, through presence, through a kind of intelligence that cannot be reduced to a single narrative. And as this shift unfolds, you may notice a strange paradox emerging within you. You feel less certain about who you are, yet more grounded in your experience. You feel less attached to specific roles or identities, yet more connected to something essential within yourself. Jung described this not as confusion, but as a transition into a more fluid state of being, a state where you're no longer confined by rigid self-concepts, but are instead able to respond to life in a way that is authentic to each moment. This does not mean becoming inconsistent or unstable. It means becoming adaptable without losing your center. It means recognizing that who you are is not a fixed point, but a living process. This transformation often looks like instability from the outside. People who only understand the first awakening may see you questioning beliefs you once held firmly. They may notice that you are no longer as predictable, no longer as easy to categorize. And this can create concern, not because something is wrong, but because your way of being no longer fits into familiar patterns. Jung observed that this stage can be particularly uncomfortable in relationships because others often try to relate to you based on who you used to be. And as that version of you dissolves, the connection itself may feel uncertain. This contributes to the loneliness that often accompanies the second awakening. But this loneliness is different from the one you may have felt before. It is not rooted in disconnection from others, but in the realization that the path you're walking cannot be fully shared. It is an inward journey, one that requires you to confront aspects of yourself that cannot be externalized or explained away. And while this can feel isolating, it is also where a deeper form of connection becomes possible, one that is not based on roles or expectations, but on presence. Another dimension of this process that Jung emphasized is the movement from the mind into the body. The first awakening is largely cognitive. It changes how you think, how you interpret your experiences, how you understand yourself and others. But the second awakening moves beyond thought. It begins to involve your physical and emotional experience in a more direct way. You may notice sensations that are difficult to explain, tension that seems to arise without a clear cause, waves of emotion that do not fit into a narrative. This is because the integration that is happening is no longer intellectual. It is somatic. It involves the deeper layers of your psyche, the parts of you that were formed before language, before conscious thought. And these layers do not respond to logic in the same way the mind does. They require a different kind of attention, one that is patient, non-judgmental, and open. The challenge here is that the ego often tries to interpret these experiences as problems to solve. It looks for explanations, for strategies, for ways to regain control. But the second awakening does not move through control. It moves through surrender. Not surrender in the sense of giving up, but in the sense of allowing the process to unfold without forcing it into a familiar structure. This is one of the most difficult aspects of the journey, because everything you learned during the first awakening encouraged you to understand, to analyze, to make sense of your experience. And now, you're being asked to let go of that need, to trust something that does not always provide immediate answers. Jung described this as developing a relationship with the unknown, a willingness to remain in uncertainty without rushing to resolve it. This does not mean abandoning awareness. It means expanding it. It means recognizing that not everything can be understood through the same lens, that some aspects of your experience require you to feel rather than explain, to observe rather than control. And as you begin to relate to yourself in this way, something shifts. The tension between different parts of you becomes less about conflict and more about coexistence. This is where Jung's idea of the transcendent function becomes relevant. It is not about transcending your humanity, but about transcending the need to choose between opposing aspects of yourself. Instead of identifying with one side and rejecting the other, you begin to hold both. You can be strong and vulnerable, certain and uncertain, grounded and evolving at the same time. And rather than creating confusion, this creates a deeper sense of wholeness. This wholeness does not come from eliminating contradiction. It comes from integrating it. It comes from recognizing that your psyche is not meant to be simplified into a single consistent identity. It is meant to be experienced in its full complexity. And as this understanding deepens, your relationship with yourself becomes less about control and more about trust. Jung observed that people who allow this process to unfold fully undergo a profound shift in how they relate to life. They stop seeking in the way they once did, not because they have found all the answers, but because the urgency behind the search begins to dissolve. The need to become something, to achieve a certain state, to arrive at a final understanding, gradually fades. What replaces it is a quieter form of presence, one that does not depend on constant movement or improvement, one that is not driven by the need to fix or optimize every aspect of the self. This presence is not passive. It is deeply engaged, but in a different way. It is rooted in the experience of being, rather than in the pursuit of becoming. This is often misunderstood as stagnation or complacency, but in reality, it is a sign of integration. It reflects a shift from striving to being, from constructing identity to experiencing it. And while this may appear less dramatic than the breakthroughs of the first awakening, it is far more stable. It does not rely on external validation or internal narratives to sustain itself. You may also notice that your relationship with your own emotions changes. Instead of trying to manage or control them, you begin to allow them to move through you more naturally. There is less resistance, less judgment, less urgency to change what you feel. This does not mean you become overwhelmed or passive. It means you develop the capacity to experience your emotions without being defined by them. This capacity is at the core of what Jung referred to as individuation, the process of becoming whole. Not perfect, not fixed, but whole. A state where all aspects of the self are acknowledged, where nothing essential is excluded. And this is what the second awakening ultimately leads toward. It is not about reaching a higher level of consciousness in the way it is often described. It is about becoming more fully human, more capable of holding the full range of your experience without needing to reduce it to something simpler, more able to live in alignment with what is true, even when that truth is complex or uncomfortable. If you are in this phase right now, it may not feel like progress. It may feel like something is breaking down, like the ground beneath you is no longer stable. But Jung would suggest that this is not a collapse. It is a reorganization, a movement toward a deeper order that cannot be constructed consciously, but must emerge through experience. The confusion, the uncertainty, the sense of not knowing, these are not signs that you have lost your way. They are signs that the path has moved beyond what the mind can fully grasp. And while that can be unsettling, it is also where the most significant transformation occurs. You are not losing what you gained from your first awakening. The awareness, the insight, the understanding, all of that remains. But it is no longer your identity. It becomes something you can use rather than something you have to be. And this shift changes everything, because when awareness is no longer tied to identity, it becomes more flexible, more responsive, more alive. It allows you to engage with life in a way that is not limited by rigid self-concepts. It allows you to move between different aspects of yourself without losing your sense of center. And at the core of all of this, what remains is something simple but deeply profound. Not a concept, not a label, not a role, but a direct experience of being. An experience that does not require you to be anything other than what you are in this moment. This is what the second awakening is moving you toward. Not a better version of yourself, but a more complete one. Not a final answer, but a deeper relationship with the questions themselves. Not certainty, but a kind of clarity that exists even in uncertainty. And when this process is allowed to unfold fully, what emerges is not someone who has transcended life, but someone who is fully engaged with it. Someone who no longer needs to escape complexity because they have learned to live within it. Someone who no longer needs to define themselves in opposition to anything because they have integrated the parts that once felt divided. That is the quiet transformation Jung spent his life trying to describe. Not a dramatic awakening, but a gradual unfolding. Not a destination, but a way of being. And if you are here in this moment recognizing even a part of this experience, then you are already within that process. Not falling apart, but slowly, deeply coming together.